Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain here with part 2 of Time Force, Changing Your Destiny. Last time, we spoke of how the opening 4 episodes of Time Force started strong as a means to develop the narrative and the themes. We also began talking about how some of those same themes relate back to the characters, resulting in some of them growing and others not so much. And now, we'll keep our discussion going by analyzing the progression of the most important characters, the role villains have to play, as well as breaking down the season in its totality. So, without any further delay, let's jump right into Wesley Collins. Wes is a fun character, very similar to Leo Corbett in a lot of ways, but using his father in the way that they did, Time Force created a completely different character with a completely novel way of developing. He starts off as just another devil-may-care rich kid who seems fairly set on, but not overly enthusiastic about, the idea of one day taking over his father's company. But then, he happens upon Jen fighting some Cyclobots, and just like that, his destiny is forever altered. The push and pull that is Jen and Wes represents one of the best character dynamics in all of Power Rangers. Both characters find themselves on opposing sides of many issues. Sometimes Jen goes a little overboard, and other times Wes just isn't overboard enough. And that's important, because there's a balance to their many spats well before they end up liking and fully trusting each other, even though Wes obviously never didn't like Jen. And without this dynamic, Wes would have never developed into an all-time great ranger, because the first major change he goes through is accepting Jen's perspective on how serious stopping Rancic is, and he naturally progresses from there through Jen and his team, but most importantly, through his father. When Wes realizes just how greedy his father can be, he finally stands up and says, "Keep your plans, I'm making my own destiny," a very bold and difficult proclamation. But then, because rangering has to be kept secret, Mr. Collins sees Wes picking up trash as an odd job, and disappointment naturally ensues. But Mr. Collins finds out about the ranger side of his job anyways through what I'd call improbable means. But that event spurs a change in him, because at this point, Mr. Collins had been adamant about protecting the city and wanted to use ranger technology to help do it. But when he learns that his son is a ranger, all of a sudden, Wes takes priority. And then, later on, Mr. Collins actually starts listening to him about important developments like the Trizerium crystals. All of this goes back to the Mr. Collins Rancic confrontation I mentioned in part 1, during an episode when Venomark, the mutant who infected Rancic, returns. Rancic comments on how Mr. Collins threw Wes out of his life, but Mr. Collins rejects his claim, finally stating that he's proud of his son. And wouldn't it have just been the most heartbreaking thing if he died right then and there and Wes never got to hear it firsthand? Which would have happened if not for the return of Alex, who was either brought back from the brink, or was never really dead, or some time travel explanation. This is an important time for Wes, because at this point, he's been on track for changing his destiny. He's been constantly improving at this ranger thing, Jen and the others fully trust him, Eric's starting to somewhat come around, and even his father is now firmly on his side. This was the perfect time to introduce a ripple in the water, so to speak. Not only is Mr. Collins on the path towards death, but Alex is coming back to force fit his way back onto the team. Why didn't he tell his fiancée of all people that he was providing Time Shadow support? Well, because he's an asshole. Why did he wait so long to return? Refer to previous answer. Why is he just so terrible at leading this team now? I think you get that much. It's almost comedic just how awful he is, despite having been very good at this job back in the year 3000, prior to Rancic's escape through time. He was leading the exact same team at that point, the same team that helped clean up the streets, you'll remember. But, in an interesting and probably intentional development, Alex is actually behind the times because he's too caught up in his old ways, even though 2001 is way older than him, a clever reversal of the whole previous generations are out of touch idea. Because of all of this, Wes is forced into returning back to what he assumed was his old destiny. This is important because of the way Wes is portrayed. He doesn't see his father as some corporate villain, at least most of the time. He sees him as the man that raised him, and more recently, the man who's been going through his own changes in relation to the hero work Wes is doing. The man who said he was proud of him. But in a situation like this, where Mr. Collins is actually supposed to die, it makes perfect sense that Wes barely hesitates to follow in his father's footsteps. It's only after Alex of all people finally realizes that it's no longer his destiny to lead the Rangers that he saves Mr. Collins and gives Wes the Red Morpher back. Alex changed what he thought was his destiny, literally admitting to himself that times are changing, which in turn allowed Wes to continue changing his own. I know it seems like I'm talking a lot about other characters when this section is supposed to be about Wes, but in reality, Wes's development has a lot to do with other characters. Eric, Jen, even Trip to a lesser degree, and especially his father, all contribute to his character arc, an arc that ties together and influences many other character arcs while it's progressing, because all of those aforementioned characters are shaped throughout the season as a direct result of Wes, in addition to Wes being shaped by them. Wesley Collins is so tightly ingrained into the season's narrative and structure that nothing about Time Force works without him, and specifically him, as a major focal point. His actual progression is fairly straightforward, going from rich kid to hero with a couple of noteworthy bumps along the way. See also Summer Lansdowne. But where his character really becomes one of the more interesting ones, on top of how engaging he is, lies in how many people he connects to, and the ways those same people change because of his effect on them, and vice versa. In many ways, Wes fully embraces the title of this video because of what he accomplished and what he facilitated. Both aspects of his character mattered here, and both were handled very well. And this brings us to Jen Scott, arguably the greatest Pink Ranger to ever do it. She goes through more than most in her battle against the forces of evil, but she accepts that and works harder because of that. There are times when she is literally the only one training while her team is either oversleeping or sorting out their hair. And that's exactly the mentality this team needed from their leader, a commanding presence that understands that Time Force is a job first, a job that if they fail at, will result in global catastrophe. Her character and the progression she goes through is the emotional focal point of the season, insofar as to say that her emotions drive the story. Jen, more so than any other character, is pushed personally throughout the season, and Aaron Cahill does a great job at hitting every high and the multiple lows. And the episodes that focus on her digs into how she feels personally afflicted by the events of the episode, especially with Time Force Trader, since Celix was Jen's old Time Force partner. But even for as unbreakably tough as Jen is, even she needed to open up, and in doing so, helped foster a better overall team. One that didn't need to be in battle mode 24/7, but could also focus up when the time calls for it. She went from authoritarian to a more balanced leader who learned to view Wes as more of a co-captain as time progressed, which is why it was so important to have them disagree so much early on. Both of them changing each other, challenging each other through those debates, and both of them being right and wrong at different times created two exceptional Rangers who grew through those experiences, and neither would be exceptional if they had stayed the same throughout the entire season. Now, if only Troy Burrows could understand that, but for another time. But Jen isn't always tough, which adds more layers to her character. Notice the effect Alex has on her until the very end when she finally realizes, yeah, no, not marrying your ass. The others are quick to speak out against Alex and his so-called leadership, but we know it's different for Jen because, well, fiancé is pretty self-explanatory. If it was anyone else, she'd get in their face and demand better. But because it's Alex, it's different, and it should be. The decision to make her far more willing to go along with Alex's return makes sense, because this is the only person that could do this to Jen, especially given the fact that she would have flamed out of Time Force without Alex. Before Wes entered her life, Alex did change her for the better too, which is why they were planning on getting married. Alex's return comes at a time when Jen is struggling with her feelings for Wes too, which also makes sense because she probably feels a little guilty about falling in love again so soon, and that's on top of the fact that Wes looks so similar to Alex. I can't even imagine the psychology behind that one, but since Jen isn't terribly expressive, we don't go too deep into what her mentality is on that front, save one episode where Jen gets a little bit of voiceover narration. But because of Wes, she changes herself and her own destiny by going back to save him and finally bringing Rancic in, for good this time. And while it's pretty easy to praise Wes and dump on Alex, it bears noting that the Great One wouldn't be who she is without both. Speaking of Rancic, you might have noticed that Jen and Rancic's progression has a unique connection. In addition to the fact that Rancic almost killed Alex, this sense of anger ties her and Rancic together in a lot of interesting ways. Both of them feel a deep seething hatred for the other side, but the difference is Jen has allies she can, and eventually does trust, while Rancic has the worthless Gluto, a spoiled daughter, and Frax, who we learn is primed to betray him later in the season. Even though it happens to Jen first, it's only when both characters realize just how much they love someone that they really truly change. In Rancic's case, it takes almost harming his daughter to realize that none of his goals for conquest are worth it if she isn't around. Which goes back to the humanity bit we discussed with Trip and Nadira. Rancic's hatred fueled him, but love resolved him, which is as poetic an ending to a Power Rangers villain arc since Astronema. And, also similar to Astronema, he actually joins the good guys to help fight the current threat in the very next season. Frax, on the other hand, represents what happens when you abandon your humanity instead of connecting to it, since he's fueled by revenge, same as Jen, from the start of the season, but carefully waits for just the right moment to strike. In a lot of ways, he might be more sinister than Rancic, and certainly more evil than Nadira or Gluto. Notice, however, that while Jen's emotional turmoil was mostly kept in check by her very loving teammates, the former Dr. Ferrix doesn't have that same luxury. Rancic's hatred towards humanity turned Frax towards hatred, and so the cycle goes. As he himself explained to Nadira, it's not a coincidence that the robots Frax created to help carry out Rancic's hate-filled goals are actually called Cyclobots. That's just really clever. And then, by having Nadira finally break that cycle by choosing not to hate despite differences, see again Trip the Zybrian who loves all things human, she converts for the better, saves a baby, and helps save the day. Both Nadira and Frax could have just been throwaway comic relief villains just like Lothor's nieces, but by adding welcome complexity towards the villain side of things, Time Force found a very effective and compelling use for both of them. Power Rangers Time Force is a great season of Power Rangers. The layered storytelling, the well-connected character arcs, and the thematic resonance all deliver. It's a season about changing each other, changing yourself, and choosing your own path. And almost every noteworthy character gets a chance to embrace all three of those kinds of change. But before we talk about some of the more technical details done right here, let's talk about some of the things Time Force doesn't do as right. The idea of time travel is fine and helps foster a ton of the narrative, but it is kind of strange that individuals from the year 3000 seem to adapt to 21st century life incredibly easy. When you really think about it, odd jobs should be the last thing they're qualified for, since they probably have robots in the year 3000 for every kind of job they could possibly get hired to do. The odd jobs aspect is also a positive in terms of technical details, so we'll come back to it. But it is a wonder that they went specifically with the year 3000 for their futuristic setting, especially since if they had gone with just the year 2100, for example, you could still justify all of their advances in technology, but also have their adaptability to their new setting seem more believable. In addition, multiverse makes it so that changing the future doesn't change the future you came from, i.e., they won't run into the Back to the Future problem of vanishing. But it does undercut the early emotional weight from Katie's best episode. It also makes Alex look even worse, since he knows that the changing future isn't affecting him. Otherwise, he can't say Wes died in the final fight and also be alive to say that, since Wes is his ancestor. But he uses that to weasel his way back onto the team, despite the fact that the most logical explanation is that, yes, Time Force is changing the future, but not the future they know. They're simply creating another branch in the endless network of alternate universes that exist. But since the year 3000 has a handle on time travel, it makes sense that they'd still be able to communicate specifically to that version of the year 3000, even if their travels created a completely different year 3000. But hey, I'm not an expert, so take my words for what they're worth. But it did seem like Time Force wanted to have their cake and eat it too, when they really didn't need to, and that story mechanic created almost every plot hole in the season. Additionally, there's just no getting around the fact that more could have been done with Lucas and Katie, but especially Lucas. Katie had 3 focus episodes, but 2 of them are just filler side quests that don't really add depth to her. The one that actually does is the same one that's undercut by the time travel logic of the season, as I explained. But Lucas also has 3 focus episodes, and despite his short-lived relationship with Nadira being one of the most hilarious episodes of Power Rangers, none of it really does much for him in the way of actual development. We don't even really get a deeper look into why he loves racing specifically, which could be interesting since he's by no means a traditionally competitive sort, so he's probably not a traditional racer either, and the fact that he does choose Time Force over racing isn't an in-depth conversation either. Also, not really too much to say about the Lightspeed Rescue team-up other than it's always great to see Carter, Viper still can't act worth a damn, and that's about it. This next point isn't a knock against Time Force, but more of an interesting point of conversation. Isn't it strange that every cryogenically frozen villain is a mutant in the year 3000? Even the ones that did almost nothing received that same sentence. It's directly implied that in the year 3000, not every mutant is evil. Steelix was once part of Time Force, and Dash was once a professional racer, same as Lucas. But mutants are the only frozen prisoners, which may speak to what society is like in the year 3000. It feels like in this time, all the fears the lower class aliens had about SPD came to fruition, except with mutants, since cleaning up the streets literally means locking up the mutants and seemingly no one else. It does make sense that in a society at least partly defined by genetic perfection, that the largest prejudice would be against mutants. Otherwise, this guy would not have ended up in the same situation as this guy. This helps give weight to Rancic's hatred until Jen explains that people actually did try and help him, an early reference to Frax well before his truth is revealed. But even though it's never explicitly shown or discussed, I would not be at all surprised if there were mutants who were never offered help and were always belittled and chastised for being born differently. Alex exists, so we know they never cured Asshole in the future, which then leads to a life of crime, and there's your entire vault of weekly creatures. This genetic angle is directly inspired by Gattaca, one of the most important works of cinematic science fiction to date, and in that society, everything, even first dates, are judged by genetics. So, it would make perfect sense for this fictional year 3000 to follow a similar framework. It's a time where aliens can be Green Rangers, but notice that Trip looks human enough. He could even easily change his hair to fit in further if he so desired. But if you look too different, you're that much more likely to be arrested, even for petty crimes. Nadira is kind of an exception to that, but she was raised by Rancic, so despite her being probably more visually appealing than many genetically perfect humans in her time, she would have learned Rancic's prejudice if things had ended differently. Time Force doesn't actually comment on their future society too much, and it's something that will be much more applicable to our future discussion of Space Patrol Delta, but it's at least interesting to dig a little deeper into. But, on a brighter note, Time Force does way more right than wrong. The idea of living in a clock tower of all things and needing to do random labor to survive was a great idea. And not just because the clock tower is perhaps another fitting cinematic reference in a season filled with many cinematic references and inspirations. Remember, the Time Force team is completely on their own out here, with backup only ever coming in the form of Captain Logan's very minimal communications or the Zords. Unlike SPD or Lightspeed Rescue, where the team is being financially backed by a very large organization, Time Force's organization is all the way back home, so they need to stay afloat on their own financially in addition to battling Rancic. And again, since they come from the very distant future, these tasks should be mostly beneath them, but they have to do it. And that also applies to Wes, since being rich and having a butler also makes certain forms of labor alien to him. Which also creates the most sensible "I'm so disappointed in you" moment when Mr. Collins eventually does catch Wes in the act of odd-jobbing. But this is what Time Force needs to do to survive. It's a small but crucial part of eventually saving the world, which also gives them a lot more in common with Eric's struggles than anyone first realizes. All of this goes back to connecting the characters and priming most of the Rangers and nearly all of the major supporting characters for change, because you really can't change your destiny unless you change the way you go about doing things. Every character that does change eventually comes to that understanding, and in every single case, it connects back to another character also going through an arc, which also is then fostered by another, and so on and so forth, until almost everything in the season is interconnected in a wide variety of ways. But even though they're connected, and there's plenty of parallels to go around, no character goes through exactly the same kind of change, and even similar developments never happen at the same time. Everyone progresses as they should at distinct points in time, given who they are and who they'll eventually become, because it's not about changing history. As we've discussed, the year 3000 they know stays intact throughout. It's about changing your history, changing your story, changing yourself, and as a result, becoming heroes, or just less villainous. Time Force as a season makes it explicitly clear that changing your destiny is never easy, but it's always possible. And if you're going through it, or if you went through it, then you just might be a major help to someone else who's trying to change theirs. Oh, and also, hate is bad. Break the cycle. And that was Time Force, a thematic analysis. As always, let me know what you thought of the season and its many interesting qualities. Eventually, I will continue my Ranger top 10s, but since the last 4 Ranger videos have been reviews of seasons I love, it only seems fair that we dip our toes into something else next time. That's right, the Megaforce video is finally happening, and doesn't it just fill you with such excitement that we get to talk about the wooden plank known as Troy Burrows. But all in good time. You just know I had to end it on a pun. And until then, thanks for watching.
I think the future looks pretty bright.